So yeah, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining our session on new forms of oppression. And this session will be about the process of advocating and campaigning on the anti-policing tech bill passed last summer, or I guess fall, on predictive policing and facial recognition. We have a really great team presenting today. One of which is Covalence, an anti-surveillance education and community building organization. The other is the Coalition Against Predictive Policing, and the last is Alliance for Police Accountability. We will have an APA rep join us shortly. So first we'll introduce ourselves. So my name is Bonnie Fan. I am with Covalence and the Coalition Against Predictive Policing. I'm also a student at Carnegie Mellon, which is how I got involved with the Coalition Against Predictive Policing. I'll turn it over to Emily.
Hi, my name is Emily Black. I'm with the Coalition Against Predictive Policing Pittsburgh, and I am also a graduate student at Carnegie Mellon in the Computer Science Department.
Hi everyone, my name's Josh Williams. I'm also with the Coalition Against Predictive Policing, and like Bonnie and Emily, I'm a grad student at Carnegie Mellon as well.
Hey folks, my name is Catherine. I'm also a grad student at CMU, and I'm with Covalence.
So in our session today, we're hoping to contextualize the campaign against predictive policing and facial recognition by talking more broadly about the use of these tools in the context of the history of surveillance, and then talk a little bit more about policing technology in Pittsburgh and the reasons that spurred us to advocate against it. We'll then go into what we did and did not get in the bill that passed, and then spend more time on lessons learned from the process. And we'll end with actions that you can take today in response to those lessons learned, in particular with the AP ballot initiative. The other thing is we will have a break in the middle of the session because Zoom is long and hard. But you also are free to take a step out and, go to the bathroom or stretch whenever you need. We also have in the chat a separate notepad where we are asking folks to just put their questions, because those the notepad has the different sections here that you can ask about. And that way we can address them at the end with Q&A. So I'll hand it over to Catherine.
Cool. Thanks, Bonnie. So I wanted to get started by talking about this first narrative of surveillance. Does surveillance equal safety? Well, for advocates like the police, it does. For example, if you're in downtown Pittsburgh, wouldn't it be so great if we could catch a burglar on camera if he happened to get mugged? Or if there are Amazon Ring cameras everywhere, wouldn't it be so great if someone's property got vandalized, we could just catch them on camera and report this vandal to the property owner? So these are the narratives that we're presented with by, the police, the state, mainstream media, and to resist the story, we have to fill in the blanks. Surveillance of who, by who, and using what? So here are two timely examples. In the recent Black Lives Matter protests, let's fill in the blanks, right? So surveillance was of mostly Black protesters by, I would say, mostly white police. And this used cameras and driver's license plate databases and technologies like police body cameras, and it equaled safety for who? Actually, I guess, mostly white property owners. Danger for who? Innocent folks who are caught on camera in, a racialized way. Or another example is with the recent insurrection in the Capitol, this used facial recognition. And this is surveillance of who? Mostly white alt-right by the federal government. And by who? The state. Safety for who? Not sure. Danger for, well, we could easily conclude the minority groups that are historically targeted by erosion of civil liberties that this new deployment of tech enables. So in these examples, surveillance incorporates new technology, but we notice familiar power dynamics in it. And for every time this narrative comes up, we have to ask, what are the underlying power dynamics? That's why we want to put this, what we're about to talk about in this presentation about predictive policing in Pittsburgh, into this historical context, because what we're experiencing now is not a moment in time, but a continuation of history, as the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition has put it. We want to draw out what's familiar and what's new, and how history is playing itself out right now. History speaks. After the Civil War, Frederick Douglass warned abolitionists that slavery would only be reborn in new forms. He said, "You and I and all of us had better wait and see what new form this old monster will assume, in what new skin this old snake will come forth next." Whenever a new innovation in policing or carceral practices emerges, it's helpful to return to his metaphor. The old snakes that Douglass warned about come disguised as appeals to maintain social stability or a return to normalcy. So, for example, racism is cloaked often as the need to protect capital and property, and xenophobia is cloaked as identifying and casting others as state enemies. These snakes, as Douglass put it, take the form of white supremacy and abuses of power at all levels, personal, cultural, and institutional. It's really important to just come out and name what's really happening. At the same time, new technologies and new availabilities of information transform the way surveillance is done, making it a new skin for oppression in some cases. These big data tropes, these 4 V's of volume, velocity, variety, and veracity, very catchy, I know, identify how things are changing. The power of big data comes from its ability to draw from as wide a pool as possible, a blanket information gathering mechanism rather than targeted surveillance. But then the use of data from a computer algorithm, in quotes, gives this appearance of scientific objectivity at the same time as this data itself is gathered unequally and reflects historical power dynamics. Here's one precedent. Looking back 300 years, we encounter this historical example of how these racialized dynamics of tools present themselves. In 1712, the New York City slave revolt happened. The next year, 1713, as part of a crackdown in the city, the Common Council of the City of New York passed the Lantern Laws, called, quoting the name of the law, a law for regulating Negro and Indian slaves in the nighttime. This law required all Black and Indigenous people to illuminate themselves with a lantern after sunset. It also encouraged white people to stop any Black or Indigenous person who was walking without a lantern, to bring violators to the jails for punishment. As Simone Brown, a scholar, in her book Dark Matters explains it, the candle is an early piece of technology used to control the movement of Black and Indigenous people through public space, and it's used by groups in power to enforce and further racial power dynamics. So to put it in today's language, gosh, what an advanced technology used for such an innovative method of community policing.
And going back to what Catherine opened with on the question of surveillance equaling safety, we have to look at where surveillance has been used most heavily. So many of you may be familiar with the COINTELPRO FBI operation from the 50s through the early 70s against many movement groups, including anti-war protesters and the Black Panther Party, a Black Power movement that was also about Black community power building. In New York City, the COINTELPRO operation targeting the Black Panther Party there collaborated extensively with the local New York City Police Department to surveil and track its members. And this culminated in a case in the 1960s against 21 members of the Black Panther Party on unfounded conspiracy charges. And actually what happened in this trial was such an outcry at the extent of the surveillance revealed against the Panther 21 that a countersuit was filed against the FBI after, and this resulted in a what's called the Handschu Agreement, which is a piece of legislation that created some level of police oversight that limited things such as federal and local cooperation to surveil local specific community groups. However, we saw a return to those same methods of community surveillance after 9/11 in New York City, with not just New York City, but in this case, with the spying of Muslims, where the same tactics were used, but with new tools and toys, including the use of automated license plate readers to track community members to places such as mosques. And what this resulted in was another lawsuit on the unlawful surveillance of community members that resulted in an update to that previous Handschu Agreement, showing that the Handschu Agreement at the time was not able to encompass all of these new ways of surveilling community members. So of course, none of this is far from home. Many of you may have been present or witnessed the aftermath of the celebrity protests during the larger George Floyd protests of last summer, and how the protesters were targeted by law enforcement after the fact, using many of these tools, such as social media and other technology tools. And moreover, that this was done in a collaborative so-called damage assessment and accountability task force. The other part, of course, is that these charges have been refiled not very long ago, as of January 8th, using those same tools. And what they used were things such as social media posts and live streams, in one case, facial recognition technology, in some cases, good old-fashioned video surveillance footage, but also things like body camera footage and driver's license photos from the Department of Transportation database at the state level. So this brings us to the state of policing technology in Pittsburgh and some of the reasons why we had for advocating against it. So I'll turn that over to Emily.
Thanks, Bonnie. Yeah, so now I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the surveillance technology available in Pittsburgh and why we have advocated for a ban on those. So one surveillance technology available in Pittsburgh is predictive policing, which was used in Pittsburgh from 2017 to 2019 as a part of a collaboration between Carnegie Mellon University and the Pittsburgh Police Department. Importantly, this predictive policing technology was first deployed in Homewood for experimentation without any public input, any kind of public hearings or anything like that. So what is predictive policing and how does it work? Very briefly, predictive policing refers to machine learning systems that aim to predict where future crime happens or who will commit future crime by analyzing past crime patterns. So in Pittsburgh, we have a location-based predictive policing algorithm, and this works by first collecting crime data from past crime and 911 calls, finding patterns in that data with a machine learning algorithm, and then using those patterns to quote unquote predict where new crime may occur. These are given in the form of maps with hotspots to the police each week, and police used to then be deployed on these extra patrols to these hotspots. Again, it ended in 2019, but this is what would happen. So maybe this sounds okay, but as I'll explain over the next few slides, there are many problems with this technology. It's, as Catherine and Bonnie were saying, an old snake in new skin. And as the Coalition Against Predictive Policing learned more about predictive policing and this program in Pittsburgh, we came to work towards a ban, and I'm going to explain why we wanted a ban in detail. There are three sort of main reasons here. One is that the algorithm itself is biased, and that's because machine learning doesn't predict the future, it replicates the past. And the past that a predictive policing algorithm will be replicating is the biased policing patterns that are not just in our past, but in our present. And on top of this, it's a profit-driven way of perpetuating these biased policing practices without actually making communities safer, as it claims. Third-party reports show that predictive policing actually has no effect on safety. And finally, besides taking money away from the city that could be used for other purposes in order to perpetuate bias, it also lends a veil of objectivity to that bias, to that same old predictive policing practices. Whereas, you know, an officer making the decision to over patrol a community of color, there's a chance to label that as what that is, bias. But if an officer can say, well, that's what the computer told me to do, less questioning may come out of that. So first, I'm going to explain what I mean when I say that predictive policing is biased, because we have biased data going in, and a machine learning algorithm can't get out of that cycle. So here I have two pictures. On the left, I have drug use data from Oakland, California, based on data from the National Institute of Health and hospitals in the area. As you can see, the areas in red are where drug users are, so they're kind of everywhere, as we probably may have expected. And then on the right, however, is where drug arrests actually occur. And you can see this is localized pretty much to one neighborhood with just very small amounts of arrests anywhere else. And as you might be able to imagine, this is a community of color. So police are over arresting in that one area where, you know, whether or not we think of drug use as crime is a whole nother conversation, but where quote unquote crime is happening many other places. So arrest reports don't actually show where crime happens. It shows where police go and where they arrest. And this is going to overexpose people of color to be, you know, in these arrest records. And therefore this data, the patterns that exist in the data that the algorithm is going to learn from, is going to keep on going back to these neighborhoods. It can't find the crime that's on the map on the left because it doesn't know about it. It only knows the arrests that are in the map on the right. So it's going to zero in on that. Now you may say, okay, that was Oakland, but these racist patterns persist in Pittsburgh too, as I'm sure many of us are aware. So predictive policing algorithms trained on this data could also lead to bias. The Black population in Pittsburgh is 24%, but the percent of Black people of those who are arrested for violent crimes in Pittsburgh is 84%. So that's a gross overrepresentation of Black people in arrests in Pittsburgh. Finally, you know, as we've sort of mentioned already, the justification for a lot of these technologies is that they're keeping us safe. It's like a safe way. We're gaining safety. Maybe there's a little bit of bias, but it's keeping our communities safer. But based on third-party objective evidence, this actually isn't the case. So third-party reports from the RAND Corporation show that while predictive policing can increase the rate of arrest, it often does not actually make communities safer. So this was based off of their investigation of the predictive policing tools used in Chicago, where predictive policing is actually used to predict who will commit future crimes in order to target individuals to monitor. And so what the RAND Corporation did was that it checked to see the difference in probability of who is likely to be involved in a shooting, which is what that list of people was trying to predict, what the predictive policing program was trying to predict, seeing if the people on the list were more likely to be involved in the shooting or if there was no difference between people on the list and off the list. And they found that there was no difference in terms of likelihood of people to be involved in a shooting on versus off the list. However, people who were on the list were more likely to be arrested because the Chicago Police Department was using this as a case closer in order to get cases off the books. And so people were being arrested from that list of people. There are other reports that show more promising numbers for the effects of predictive policing. However, they're often made by creators of predictive policing algorithms that they then want to turn into for-profit ventures to sell to other police departments. So those reports require a lot more scrutiny than something like a third-party report. So there are problems with the technology of predictive policing itself that led us to want to legislate, and in particular to legislate for a ban. But there are also problems with the rollout and the use of the technology in Pittsburgh that motivated the need for legislation. And in particular, the use of predictive policing in Pittsburgh and elsewhere suffers from a lack of transparency and community input. In Pittsburgh, there were no public hearings, press conferences about the police's decision to use the new technology. Our records requests about police use were repeatedly denied. There was no community input on the decision to unleash this technology on the citizens of Pittsburgh or to use the people of Homewood as a test bed preliminarily. The only people who were involved in this decision were the police department, Carnegie Mellon, and the Department of Health and Human Services. And in fact, the community was actively shut out, and that's what we're showing here in this slide. There was one chance to get to talk about this program at this panel that CMU was going to host, where people were, at first it was open to anyone who was interested in coming in Pittsburgh, but afterwards, it was shut out to only include people in the Carnegie Mellon community. As you can see, people were actually disinvited who had signed up. So just to summarize here about predictive policing and why once we learned about it, we wanted to advocate for a ban. It's a racially biased technology that perpetuates the bias of bias policing in Pittsburgh and elsewhere. And then beyond the faults of the technology itself, there is no transparency involved and no community involvement in the decisions that are made to deploy that technology. And we were hoping that legislation could provide some transparency, give power back to the people, but also make sure that this technology was not used and could not be expanded to a for-profit venture that was taking money away from the city to perpetuate bias. So now I'm going to talk about another piece of surveillance technology that we have available in Pittsburgh, which is facial recognition. So how does facial recognition work? What is it? Facial recognition is a method of identifying people based off of pictures obtained of them. So there is a database of photos that you may have that's connected to information about each individual, like their name, where they live, maybe if you're using it for police purposes, their criminal history, something like that. And then you have maybe an image of a suspect. So you upload the image of the suspect to the system, and the facial recognition software will match that image to a picture of someone in the database and show you like the potential matches of who might be that suspect. Yeah, exactly. So that this is what that might look like. So what ability do the police have, and does the criminal justice system have to use facial recognition in Pittsburgh? Well, quite a lot. So this first thing on the left here, one of the main ways that the Pittsburgh Police Department uses facial recognition is JNet. JNet is a state-run database of photos with the facial recognition systems where you can upload a picture, just like I described on the previous slide, to identify people and continue tracking people down for a case. The database for JNet is made up of state and county corrections facilities, mugshots, any basically encounter with the police that you have in the state or the county, a picture could be in there. But then on top of that, they also have information from driver's licenses, anything through the PennDOT transportation system. They have access to all of those people, pictures of all those people as well. So if you have a Pennsylvania driver's license, even if you don't have a criminal record, you are in the police database, then you can be searched. Aside from this, which is used, on the right, we have some of Zapala's vast surveillance network, where he installed thousands of cameras in Pittsburgh. They're not, to our knowledge, currently equipped with facial recognition technology, but there have been thoughts and talks of deploying facial recognition technology in those cameras, which was discovered when it broke that the district attorney's office had experimented with Clearview AI over the summer. Clearview AI is a notoriously ethically, I'd say, challenged company that collaborates with law enforcement to identify suspects, as I explained below, but their database of images that they look through is just completely taken off the internet. So any social media, any picture that's available on the web, that's the database that Clearview is drawing from. So those are two methods there, but also there's another method for surveillance in Pittsburgh that's much closer to home. So we maybe teased a little bit about how Amazon Ring doorbells could be a source of surveillance, but that's actually the truth right now. Police can request footage of whatever people have from their doorbell footage in order to use facial recognition in searches from Amazon Ring doorbell footage. So Amazon Ring has partnered with over 400 police departments, including, oh, sorry, I'm just going to address a quick question in the chat. I don't think there's any relation between Clearview AI being used to identify folks. Facial recognition was used to identify folks using JNet and social media pictures, which we'll get into later, but that wasn't through the district attorney's office. That was through the DAAT task force. Yeah, okay, cool. So yeah, Amazon Ring has partnered with 400 police forces, including the Pittsburgh police. So this partnership went through in September of 2020, notably less than a month before the resolution that we're going to talk about later was passed. But so this essentially allows police access to request access to footage from Amazon Ring doorbells, which I'm sure many of us have. And so despite this, massive, we might think like, what could possibly allow for this? I think, again, it goes back to this conversation about the justification of safety. And what we see is that despite this massive, private company controlled huge increase in surveillance, there's no evidence of Ring doorbells working with the police, reducing crime or making communities safer. So obviously we wouldn't be able to tell any patterns from the partnership with Pittsburgh since it's so new, but that work that I linked to was based off of some of Ring's longest partnerships. So now that we know a little bit about facial recognition, why would we want to ban that as well? So there are a few reasons, there are several reasons, but I'll focus on three here. One is that it allows for unprecedented surveillance of the public, while it's unclear to what extent, if any, it improves the effectiveness of law enforcement. So again, we're sacrificing a lot of privacy and actually our own safety in a sense, which I'll get into, for no real return, it seems. Also, super importantly, the technology itself is biased against people of color in that it is less accurate on darker and sometimes female faces. And as I'll go into later, not only is the technology itself biased against people of color, also who are in the databases that facial recognition searches over in the police context is biased against people of color, and where the cameras are put is biased against people of color. So at every step in the process, the bias compounds against people of color. And again, as before, this lends a veil of objectivity to the same old policing practices. If a policeman misidentified someone of color for a crime, maybe they could say, okay, maybe you have to go to racial bias training. Probably nothing would happen, but there's a chance that we could pin that down. But if if the computer says this is a match, that lends a veil of objectivity that's harder to knock down. And unfortunately, this is very clear. The risks are very clear and the harm is very clear. As I alluded to earlier, there are already 3 people that we know that have been wrongfully accused by facial recognition in a criminal context. This man here, Mr. Williams, I believe he was wrongfully accused for a crime, and when he was shown the picture that the facial recognition algorithm had identified him as a match for, it was very clear that he and the supposed perpetrator were not the same person. They looked visually very different. And so much so that even the detectives who ended up pulling him in when they saw the evidence, almost laughed because it was so different from what he looked like. And he just looked at the pictures and said, well, am I free to go? But it's not that simple. He wasn't free to go. And despite the fact that he himself and the detectives admitted that the match based on facial recognition was obviously wrong, he was kept on $1,000 bail. He had to spend the night in jail, and then he had to find himself an attorney to fight the case. They were charging thousands and thousands of dollars because everyone just assumed that he was guilty, because once he's coming into contact with the criminal justice system, he's going to face all of those biases as a Black man. So the harms are very clear to people. And again, he's just one story out of 3 so far. And the fact that those exist means that there are many more that were unreported, I believe. And finally, besides the people who are affected individually by these facial recognition systems, there's also psychological studies that show that mass surveillance changes the way we act. In particular, it makes people avoid activism out of fear of retribution. And so how would this huge surveillance, how would increasing surveillance make us safer if we can't feel safe to express our rights through protest and stuff like that? Now, another point here, as I was alluding to earlier, is that it's not just that, you know, there's this harm of people being misidentified. And again, I forgot to mention, but the people who are going to be misidentified by the algorithm are more likely going to be people of color, since it is less accurate on people of color. So that is one part of the problem here. But another part of the problem is that the disproportionate arrests that I was mentioning earlier, the fact that all these arrests are localized to the high minority community in red on the right here, means that the pictures of people that the databases contain, that facial recognition algorithms used by police are going to be searching over, is going to disproportionately include Black faces from people of color. And finally, it's not just, you know, the pictures in the database and the inaccuracies of the algorithm, but it's where the cameras are put. Here we have some pictures of Project Greenlight Detroit, which is a surveillance program in Detroit, program installing surveillance cameras in Detroit. So on the right, we have census data showing where different ethnic communities are. The green is Black communities. And on the left, we have where surveillance cameras have been installed in Detroit. And you can see that the surveillance cameras are essentially just perfectly contouring the Black neighborhoods in Detroit. So again, these surveillance systems, if we're thinking of surveillance for who, by who, it's definitely surveillance of communities of color. So that's all of that bias is one huge reason why we want a ban on facial recognition, because we know how it's going to be used in a sense. We know that it's going to be used against communities of color. But some other reasons to legislate there are some other reasons to legislate as well, one of which is mission creep. And that's essentially that without expressed bounds on what surveillance is allowed to do, it will expand endlessly. And there are several examples of these from the past. Two ones that we highlight today. One is from Chicago's gang database. So this was the predictive policing program in Chicago that I mentioned earlier. It actually originated from a predictive social services program, which was created by some university in Chicago in order to try to connect people who were likely to need social services to social services. But it was essentially reappropriated by the police in order to be used as a case closer and to arrest people off of that list. So because there were no explicit rules in place, you know, the program that started off as something completely different could be shifted and reappropriated and used in other spaces because there were no explicit blocks on how different things could be used. Similarly, I'm sure maybe some of us have, if we've taken flights, maybe not recently, but in the past, we've noticed that we are subject to face scans when we get on a plane. And this like unilateral use of facial recognition in airports is an expansion of a small Department of Homeland Security initiative from 1996. And all that initiative says is basically we're allowed to track foreign nationals coming in and out of the country. And that expanded over the past 25 years into, you know, the enormous use of facial recognition today. So without explicit limits on what surveillance can do and where it can go, it just expands boundlessly. And that's part of why we wanted legislation as well. But another reason why we wanted a ban in particular beyond just any legislation was because there was support for a ban from the public, which is important. One evidence of this was that in our, we had a petition over the summer asking for CMU to stop its use of the predictive policing algorithm, its collaboration with the Pittsburgh Police Department. And although we had intended it to be just for like people involved with CMU, we had so many signatures. There were many, many people outside the CMU community as well who supported this. So this was one piece of information that we had that a ban was likely to be supported. And then even much more importantly, the Black Activist Collective, one component of which is here, the Alliance for Police Accountability, picked up the end of facial recognition and predictive policing as part of their demands, specifically for ending the criminalization of Black people. So we had some idea that, you know, beyond all of the reasons that we thought that a ban was the right thing to do, there was also public support for a ban as well. So I've explained what some of the surveillance technologies in Pittsburgh are and why we wanted to ban them. Next, we're going to talk about the legislation that actually happened in Pittsburgh and what we wanted essentially versus what we got. So I'll hand it over to Josh.
So yeah, thanks again for coming, everyone. Before we go on, it has been about half an hour, so we do want to give you all a chance to take a short 2-minute break before we go on, because Zoom can get exhausting after a while, like we all have experienced at this point in the pandemic. So yeah, we'll come back in 2 minutes and we'll keep going. Feel free to add any questions into the doc that we've linked or just into the chat.
Yeah, and that'll be 2:12 when we come back.
2:12. And if you also just want to stay here and just stretch, get up out of your chair, that's probably what we'll be doing, but whatever everybody needs.
So we have one question added into the doc. How can we communicate it? Sure. So how can we communicate with policymakers about the technical side of these tools? And Bonnie will be getting into that after another about 10-15 minutes or so.
Oh, Veronica just asked for the speakers to identify themselves again, so we can do that very quickly. My name is Bonnie. She or they pronouns are good, and I'm with Covalence, an anti-surveillance organization, as well as the Coalition Against Predictive Policing. And then Emily.
Hi, yeah, I'm Emily. I am a graduate student at Carnegie Mellon, and I'm also with the Coalition Against Predictive Policing.
And I'm Josh. I am also a graduate student at Carnegie Mellon and a member of the Coalition Against Predictive Policing.
Hey, I'm Catherine. I'm also a grad student at CMU and a member of Covalence.
And it looks like we just hit 2:12, so we'll be continuing on. And the last question added into the doc, into the notepad, we'll get to at the end. All right, so Emily's done a great job of running through what this technology does and why we wanted to ban. But let's start into what we actually got from the ordinance that passed last September. And this bill, the intent of this bill can effectively be boiled down into this single line. The Department of Public Safety shall not obtain, retain, access, or use facial recognition technology or predictive policing technology without the approval of Pittsburgh City Council. And by having this ordinance, it means that the Department of Public Safety has to argue for their need to use technology before they can use it. And even though we've complained a lot, there is some good to this, because by having this approval process, we can create a check for the unchecked expansion of predictive policing. Like Emily mentioned, that growth into new areas that originally wasn't defined for. And unlike in Chicago and LA, the police aren't able to unilaterally expand into creating gang databases or potential lists of suspects as chosen by AI systems. And similarly, this approval cuts down on the potential for commercialization of the software. For example, when Los Angeles piloted their predictive policing program, that spun off into another private venture called PredPol Inc. And this approval process that we have now limits the ability of the researchers behind Pittsburgh's programs to do the same thing. And like when companies like Amazon try to partner with the police and try to distribute gadgets like the Amazon Ring doorbells, it creates a mechanism for stopping these partnerships to share information and share surveillance between Amazon and the police before they can even get started. But in our case, because this partnership started about less than a month before the ordinance passed, this ordinance doesn't apply to the Amazon Ring doorbell case, but in the future, this ordinance does provide something. And lastly, by having this approval process, that we can get some protection against knee-jerk surveillance reforms, like in Camden, New Jersey, in which after the 2014 protests against the death of Michael Brown at the hands of Officer Darren Wilson, Camden County avoided any sort of response to police violence or any reckoning by just transforming the city into a surveillance city, complete with automated license plate readers, police able to take control of any camera in the city, and anything that we can imagine that a surveillance city really has right now. And even though there is some good to this ordinance is still missing several things that really give the public a lot of protection. So, like Emily mentioned, the first thing that we feel this ordinance should have is it needs to be a true ban. And we learned throughout this process that deterrents really aren't as effective as a true ban. And that's why any other city that's had to deal with a problem of facial recognition technology or predictive policing has opted for a ban rather than just any sort of regulation as a deterrent. And by this ordinance being dependent on city council approving the process, any changes to the members of city council give a lot of uncertainty to the future of what's going to happen with these surveillance technologies. We may get a city council in the future that hates any sort of surveillance and will shoot down any opportunity for public safety or the police to use facial recognition or predictive policing. But it's also equally likely that we'll get a city council in the future that loves all this surveillance technology and will just act as a rubber stamp for anything the police have. There's no real certainty to how city council is going to respond to requests for surveillance use. And moreover, this bill didn't even stop the earlier predictive policing use by the Pittsburgh police. What stopped the bill was the push from the Black activists, the wider press, the outraged public, in order to get something done here that the bill just came far after. And if something like Pittsburgh's test of predictive policing happens again, this bill isn't going to stop it. It's just going to fall back to the press, the Black activists, the public, to be able to stop its use once more. And also, this ordinance doesn't even have the opportunity to give public comment. So when the police go to argue before city council that they think they should use some sort of facial recognition or predictive policing, the city council isn't required to bring the public into a public hearing or even notify the public of the approval of these sorts of technologies. And this was one of the biggest criticisms against the previous use of predictive technology, where the public didn't have any insight into what's going on, there was no transparency. And this ordinance just gives the opportunity to repeat that mistake. And if the city insists on keeping an approval process like this and not an actual ban, there needs to be some sort of public process, public hearing, before anyone can adopt the surveillance technology. Pittsburgh's already been counted as the worst city for Black women by nearly every metric. And the police going to argue that law enforcement won't violate civil rights isn't enough evidence to clear the use of this sort of technology. And moreover, there you go. Moreover, this ordinance still includes loopholes for the use of facial recognition technology. Like Emily mentioned, the state of Pennsylvania provides a system called JNet, which gives the police anywhere across the state the opportunity to search any images they find from CCTVs or from social media or anything with this database of arrest records, arrest photos, and driver's license, identification, Department of Transport IDs. And because this goes through the state, this ordinance has an explicit exception for this sort of partnership, where any activities related to databases, programs made by another government entity is exempt from this ordinance. So the main way that the police are using facial recognition technology is exempt already. And public sources already reported that the Pittsburgh police have used JNet to arrest and charge protesters from last summer. And so by having this exemption in here, This bill isn't stopping the use of facial recognition technology or predictive policing. It's just carving out the case where the police partnered with CMU, or they might try to partner with Pitt in the future, and say, you have to ask permission if you want to do this again. But for everything the police are already doing, just you have free reign because it's not handled by Pittsburgh or anyone in Pittsburgh. And there are two more things this bill is missing that to me at least is absurd, because there right now are exceptions for exigent circumstances, which give any emergency situation where the Department of Public Safety or the Chief of Police believe that there's going to be imminent death, physical harm, or property damage, they don't have to go through this approval process. They just have to notify City Council of its use after 30 days. Recently, Councilman O'Connor said that this exception was included to account for extreme cases like the attack on the Capitol a few weeks ago. He's quoted by public sources saying that you're dealing with, in my opinion, domestic terrorism as opposed to robbing a convenience store. But when using events like the Capitol insurrection as justification for surveillance use, one of our biggest fears is that the rhetoric of referring to last summer's protests as violent riots is just going to lead to the unchecked use of this surveillance technology against peaceful protesters. And because JNet has already been used to identify protesters from last summer, if the police are showing up to peaceful protests in riot gear, then this existing fear that maybe a few members of the peaceful protest have the potential for property damage is already enough to bypass everything in this ordinance altogether. And so here are the two public source articles that go into it, that the police already have the potential to bypass whatever they need in this ordinance just by claiming that it's possible that the public or the protesters may cause property damage in the future. And the very last thing that this ordinance is missing, that at least we thought of and we want to talk about today, is there needs to be a right to sue for violations of damages. This line here, should an individual be subject to a violation of this ordinance, the individual has a right of action against the City of Pittsburgh for damages. This line was taken out at the 11th hour as the very last change to the bill before it was passed. And by having this, without the right to sue, we don't really have any mechanism for ensuring the public's rights aren't being violated by this technology. And especially for damages caused as a result of this bill, there's nothing we can really do in response. And back, there we go. For example, this man here, Emily talked about one case of a false arrest from facial recognition. This man, Najir Parks, was reported last December that he was picked up as a result of a bad facial recognition match. And he had to spend $5,000, his entire life savings, fighting that case in order to be acquitted. And if that happened to someone in Pittsburgh, there's no recourse that this ordinance gives. They took out the only recourse we have. And even without the right to sue, we can't even figure out if a violation happened aside from just sending a right to know request every other week asking, did the police use facial recognition technology? Did they ask City Council anything? There's nothing, this bill doesn't empower the public to do anything. What little powers it creates is solely given to City Council, and anything that the public had the chance to do have been taken out. So while it's important that we got something that curbs the use of surveillance technologies, we still need amendments to add in these additional protections, time for public comments, some right to sue, stopping police from arbitrarily declaring there's an emergency, we need to use this. So we are going to push for additional amendments to be created and added into this bill. And in doing this, we have a lot that we've learned from the previous process of working with the original bill. And Bonnie's going to go into a little bit about what we've learned and how we plan to use that in the future. So Bonnie, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you, Josh. So basically everything that Josh has talked about has been a hard pill to swallow for us looking back on this bill, but also likely for all of you here hearing our analysis of it. And this part of the presentation is about sort of the narrative of what happened in the process of advocating for a bill and what preceded that and the lessons learned in the process. So again, as we mentioned in the beginning, this group, the Coalition Against Predictive Policing, emerged as a group within CMU concerned by the university's complicity in building tools for the police in the form of predictive policing and other harmful technology. And a lot of our work was centered around ending this project, advocacy at the university level, and building awareness and education and reaching out to community members. Of course, last summer, a huge outcry emerged post George Floyd in asking for more radical change around policing. And on June 15th, the Black Activists Collective released, I believe, a 12-point demand for both city and county on needed reforms, sort of bare minimum reforms to address those that need for change. One of them was, as Emily mentioned earlier, ending the criminalization of Black people. And what we understand is that part of the relationship building that we knew was important helped get that to awareness. So for that to be listed as a concern. So a week after, in an attempt to display some amount of change, one of the things that the city did was announcing the end of its use of predictive policing in Pittsburgh as for the Bureau of Police. When we learned about this announcement, we knew that while that was a huge victory, given the things that Emily talked about with mission creep, so the expansion of one tool into another or related tool, and also the dangers of commercialization with many academic projects in this vein, ending in an attempt to make money, so turning their research into software that they sell back to the city. And what we didn't want was a resurgence of predictive policing in a new form. So this became the basis for our teach-in on July 16th. And that directly preceded a number of public hearings on police reform that were held that week, one of which we attended and made comments. There was a council person who heard our concerns and agreed to meet with us, and that was Councilwoman Strasburger. And I know actually there are a couple folks who may have gone to Strasburger's earlier session today at PRGS, and we would love to hear what you've learned, maybe in the Rise Up pad that Emily has linked in the chat, in response to kind of what we're presenting now. So things that we learned in the build up to the ending of predictive policing was that, relationship building and building with community organizations and grassroots orgs on the ground doing the work was incredibly important. And the ending of predictive policing's use, I don't believe would have happened without that relationship building. The other is acknowledging that this happened within a much larger movement and call for change on questioning the role of police in the US. So what happened following our meeting with Strasburger's office was that we sent a draft of a predictive policing ban that we had written, as well as the bill that we found from Santa Cruz, as that was the only other existing ban on predictive policing that we had found. So we were told thank you, and sort of a month passed, and we got a notification on August 24th that Councilman O'Connor was introducing a complete ordinance the next day. So the ordinance was introduced at City Council meeting. We scrambled after, once we saw the text of the bill, as it included many of the allowances that Josh alluded to earlier, in terms of the city council approval for technologies and a number of other concerns on facial recognition technology. We in fact sent back a version of the bill that was a ban. And on September 1st, we were told that that O'Connor's office did not believe that this bill was passable without the compromises included. And this was based on a sort of model of understanding of the leanings of city council. And again, you know, this the reason why we were pushing through this process was that the city has authority over the Pittsburgh Bureau of Police, and legislation at that level would be, you know, in an effective deterrent, as Emily had mentioned, of addressing those technologies, but also addressing those university collaborations that led to the trial in the first place. So, you know, at that point of being told that those compromises were necessary in order for city council to approve this bill, what we learned later is that that was a lie, or at the very least, it was a very conservative estimate. And reaching out earlier to the individual members of city council would have yielded what we learned later, a lot of concerns that were raised as we attended additional city council meetings, where other city council members actually recognized the limitations of the bill, that the bill did not go far enough. And the other component was we recognized a lot of unfamiliarity with the technologies, you know, a lot of buy-in to the narrative of facial recognition as a positive tool for police. So recognizing the role of providing educational materials such as what we provided in this session so far. But the other thing was also recognizing that there does seem to be a limit to the capacity or desire for radical change in Pittsburgh City Council, pointing to the need for electoral work. And by that, I mean getting a new city council, which is actually work that was done in Minneapolis prior to their drastic votes on disbanding their police department. So after we were told September 1st that, you know, council will not accept this bill without compromises, we felt very shut out of the process. And the next day that bill was sent to public safety, which apparently is a typical step, you know, sending to public safety and legal. And the next week, in the next introduction of the bill, there was an inclusion of a clause for exception, the exceptions clause that Josh had mentioned, giving them powers to use the technology in exigent circumstances. And at that point, we had been, prior to that meeting, sending calls to action for community members, students, technology experts to testify at City Council about the harmful effects of this technology and advocating for a complete ban. As more and more of these compromises were added in, the messaging got more and more complex in terms of whether this bill was something even worth saving anymore or advocating for or against. And being at that juncture point, we halted calls to action to testify, as that bill was no longer something that we wanted ownership over. But what we found is, as Josh mentioned, with the halt of public comment, or sort of fewer, you know, eyes in the room, that is when they made the most drastic changes to the bill, such as the removal of the right to sue. It was, you know, in that very last introduction of the bill that it was removed and then quickly signed by the mayor. So I think this is perhaps like one of the biggest lessons for folks working in this critical tech space, as many of us bear a lot of privilege coming into the work. You know, especially affiliated with universities or technology institutions. And I think feeding into some level of trust in the legislative system, which actually bears or makes a case for learning more from abolitionist stance. One of the organizations that we learn from a lot is the Stop LAPD Spying, which has advocated against predictive policing for over 8 or 9 years at this point, and have a deep distrust of the legislative system. But the other part was that we actually limited ourselves in the sense that in rallying our capacity for advocacy, we did not consider a predictive policing ban until we saw that one had passed in Santa Cruz just last summer. But also in making decisions around calls to action, you know, as a limited group with volunteer time, weren't sure that we would continue to be able to advocate in a new legislative session, you know, especially coming out of the summer of, you know, calls for change, a new, more radical bill. And I believe that those limitations or self-limitations contributed to the less than great outcomes in the bill that we got. And another, just the most important part is that it is not over till it's over. And even now it is not over. As Josh mentioned, there are needed amendments for this bill that has passed. But again, it was in those sessions where public comment was not present that they made the most drastic, egregious changes. And so we know that City Council does act very differently when they believe that no eyes are on it. And going back to the lessons around trusting the system, this was playing City Council's game. You know, the amount of compromise introduced and added on to the bill resembles a few other bills that we've seen in the past, unfortunately. And so in a little bit, I'll turn it over to Kina from the Alliance for Police Accountability to talk instead about the approach that APA has made on two really important ballot initiatives at the city and county level that rely on the power of the people, and introducing a ballot initiative to be voted on in the spring. So Kina, if you want to talk a little bit about Breonna's law and solitary confinement, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, can everybody hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay. So thank you for having me. Yeah, we are pretty much at the peak of these two vital ballot initiatives. The first one being to pass Breonna Taylor laws against the use of no-knock warrants. A lot of people think it's a small thing, but this is exactly what caused Breonna Taylor's death, right? Now they'll tell you in Allegheny County that they don't even practice this, that this is not a thing. So it's not needed, which is false. We actually had an activist about a month ago get her door kicked in and them hold guns to her kids' heads. And, you know, anything could happen in that situation. And we just want to prevent that from happening. It's also like the use of unnecessary excessive force. And when they break into your homes, you know, you're the one who has to pay for that. So if they break your door, you have to pay for that. When they ransack your home, you have to replace all of that. They don't replace it for you. Like, take a look at what happened in McKeesport a little over a month ago. Pulling people out of their homes half naked in the snow, no shoes on, in search for one individual, right? So it's very important that we get this done, and we're doing everything that we can to make that happen. When it comes to solitary confinement, that's a practice of mental abuse itself. So if you go to jail and you're going through withdrawal, or you have a mental health problem, or you are portrayed as violent, they throw you in what most people call the hole, but they throw you in solitary confinement. And, there has been many cases where this has led to suicide. Allegheny County Jail actually has one of the highest suicide rates in the country. And we're also only one of the only counties that are still practicing the restraint chair, which is similar to what the electric chair looks like. They bound you to the chair, they bind you to the chair, they put a spit bag over your head. And it's just something, it's just very terrible, like if you want to punish somebody, it will make a huge difference to just leave them in their cell where they have a window or something. I mean, jail is a horrible place to begin with. Like there's no reason to abuse somebody's mental like that. And like they don't have, like they have full control over how long you're in there. It's not like they tell you, oh, you're going to be in there for 24 hours. Oh, you're going to be in there for a week. In some instances, people are in there for a year. Sometimes they don't feed you. Sometimes they don't let you bathe when you're in solitary confinement. You're not allowed visits. You're not allowed to see anybody other than the CO. And by nature, human beings are social people. So, I mean, it's just very detrimental. And the point of going to jail is to come out reformed, not to come out and fall into the practice of recidivism, right? Like that's not the point of it. And as somebody who has been to jail myself for for a crime I did not commit, just being in jail in general is mentally draining. So I can only imagine what it's like for somebody to be in solitary confinement. So we're working extremely hard to make sure that these two things get passed and get put onto the ballot for the mayor's election. And we're on the path for success, but it takes a lot. It definitely takes a lot. We have sign-in stations all over the county. So, there's, if you go to the website, apa-pgh.org, you'll be able to click in and type in your address and see which sign-in station is close to you. You can set up a day of action. You can go on the website also and get petitions to print out, have your family members sign them. Like, we need 27,000 signatures. We're shooting for 35,000 because we know how the county plays. They'll try to toss some out and things like that. So we're definitely getting much more than 27,000 to have a cushion. But it's a step in the right direction. Like it sucks that we have to go through all these loopholes to get to a world that we envision as better as for like the betterment of all of us. But unfortunately, we have to go through these processes. So we're definitely out here doing the work with so many organizations, so many people. There's just so many people involved in this, and it's great. Like, to see something that was an idea be worked so hard on to become a reality, So yeah, thanks. If anybody has any questions, let me know.
Thank you, Nat. And also, I think I remember you and Brandy had mentioned that you had approached City Council for Brianna's law, and they did not do it. So I think having seen the amount of work that you all are doing in rallying and organizing petition signers and other organizations to help host events or signing stations, You know, it's an enormous amount of people work, but it seems to be the route that is actually going to get change to happen. And that number of signatures, 30,000, is a lot to require on paper during COVID. So I
Yeah,
think,
like it's funny you said that because it was brought to council and they shut it down. We had to get lawyers, go through all these legalities to even make Brianna's law specifically possible. And they now because they see all the work we're doing, they're actually writing a legislation for it, which is ironic. But we're gonna keep doing what we're doing because we don't want just legislation. Like we want this actually to be on a charter because people can write legislations, they can be removed easily, and we do not want that. So we're trying to make sure it's a forever type thing, right?
yeah, and from this presentation, we've seen what kind of legislation they can write and unwrite.
Yes.
So yeah, I think what we want to do right here is give people a minute or two to copy these links into your browser and open them up. Again, even if you're not in Pittsburgh or Allegheny County right now, you can request a petition to sign and mail back. But you can also do more and get, you know, a larger petition sheet to get your friends and family to sign. But yeah, so we want to give people a minute to open up that link. We also put it in the chat. And then once people have gone to that website, we don't want to overwhelm people, but we've also included a link, which is 2 questions, your email and a checkbox, to join either the Coalition Against Predictive Policing mailing list or the Covalence mailing list, to stay up to date with actions on further amendments, as well as related campaigns, such as I believe there will be a county facial recognition ban bill being introduced by Liv Bennett later, as well as there's a statewide campaign called Driving PA Forward that I mentioned earlier in the chat that is trying to advocate for licenses for undocumented folks, and in the process introducing a number of privacy restrictions on what can be used in through JNet, that driver's license photo database. Which, as you can imagine, already endangers many folks, but in particular, undocumented folks. And so as you are copy and pasting these links into your browser, we are going to open the space up for questions and responses. I think we may start with the questions that were put in the doc as we were going through the presentation. But you can also raise your hand if you would like to chime in with something as well. And I will try to see those hands.
We do have quite a few questions in the doc. Should we address these first?
Yeah, I'm gonna see if I can open the doc.
Yeah, it would be good to screen share what's on there.
Okay, so here is the doc again. Oops. Maybe not, I cannot copy today. Okay, if someone can paste the doc again, I cannot copy. And I will share these questions to answer from our Rise Up pad. Oops. But I do want to make sure, again, that people have access to these links. So we'll just keep putting them in the chat as well. Here they are. And here is the.
I think it might need a HTTPS so it becomes clickable in Zoom. It's more convenient for people.
Oh, sure. Okay, then I will do that. And I do love the also related campaigns and grassroots work, and encourage people to connect to each other and drop that as well. Thanks, Emily. Sorry, that was double.
No problem. Should we start taking some of these questions?
Yeah. So actually,
Okay.
yeah, Emily, do you want to? Emily and Catherine, do you want to moderate this part?
Sure, I'm fine to do that. So I'm just going to start. I don't see that there are any hands are raised. I'm just going to start reading some questions, and like whoever wants to chime in on them, please go ahead. So one question is, how can we communicate with policymakers about the technical side of these tools effectively? Does anyone want to chime in on that?
So one of the specifics that came out of the council meetings and discussion around the bill was, I believe, Burgess in the first session expressed, you know, the opinion that facial recognition was a needed tool for providing safety to Black communities. And what's interesting is that in one of the later sessions before the bill was passed, he commented that the bill was doing nothing. So actually, we're not sure if there were some education interventions in between. But also, we did a large amount of communication with the policymakers that we were in touch with in this process about what we knew about predictive policing and facial recognition and their biases. And we do believe that more education is needed, but education alone is not everything, I think. I don't know if anyone else wants to add.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think one of the things that we need in order to communicate with policymakers is also just access. And I think that that's like a hard thing to come by sometimes, but by and large, I agree with Bonnie. Like education, I think can help and maybe even would have helped in this particular situation, but like, yeah, unclear how much it'll help it like completely overall.
Actually, so let's see, what's the next question? Oh, actually, so maybe just to jump very quickly to the APA ballot question. Can we sign the petitions if we don't live in Allegheny County? You do have to be a registered voter of Allegheny County to sign the ballot on ending solitary. And you would want to be a registered voter in the city of Pittsburgh for Breonna's law. But if you're not a registered voter, you can also sign up to volunteer by hosting a signing station or promoting the work that AP is doing elsewhere as well. Sorry, I just jumped in. I'll give it back to you, Emily and Catherine.
Oh, no, that's fine. I guess I'll also just point to some of the answers in the chat really quickly. So did City Council approve the previous trial with predictive policing? As far as I'm aware, no, because the way that the predictive policing happened was through a very special memorandum of understanding that the university had with the city of Pittsburgh. And so since it was technically like an academic experiment, I don't believe that City Council had to approve it. It was just like a relationship between the Pittsburgh Police Department and the university that they were able to coordinate. I don't know if anyone has other information on that. That's my information.
We have a little bit also more material about how Mayor Peduto approved this partnership with CMU as sort of making Pittsburgh an open laboratory and allowing these experiments to run in the city as a way of making the city some sort of innovative place. So that like a memorandum of understanding was created to allow, academic partnerships with the city, and that's how predictive policing came about. There was also a previous fire prediction tool that resulted in the mayor asking for a similar tool to be used on crime. And so that's again an example of the way that mission creep results, because you get one algorithm that's used for one thing, but then the magic thinking happens, and more tools are used in ways that may be questionable to the community. On the, should we just go by chronological order, or?
Yeah, let's take the light blue question. This, what academic fields filter into your work? Where did you all start? So, I mean, I think, I can only speak for myself, but this kind of thing that incorporates both, you know, cutting edge technology, the deep understanding of them, and community engagement doesn't really have an academic discipline. So people tend to come from all kinds of places, and mostly you share your values. Also, I see Veronica is asking, did that go through IRB for the?
Wait, I want to take that one.
Yeah, we already answered that. Sorry.
Oh yeah. Okay. Cool.
Okay.
So actually, our session is, I think, coming to an end soon in about 5 minutes. I know we wanted to also give chance for the so some of our moderators to drop in the evaluation form for the session. So I'm not sure if that's going to come through the chat or something else, but just for folks to give some time for that and look out for that. So we have a lot of great questions. I believe Deb Gross was the one who recognized that the legislation as introduced was quite limited and concerning. The right to sue component is actually, we're not lawyers, so we don't know the final answer, but it's protecting the right to sue is a more effective deterrent than just leaving it open to like civil courts. And the other Bonnie, who's a moderator, had just dropped the link to evaluate the session. We do not know the answer to stances for the mayor and Ed Gainey on predictive policing and facial recognition, but we'd love to know. And the next steps for Coalition Against Predictive Policing is definitely, yes, pushing for amendments to the ordinance, and also looking out for, again, more abolitionist approaches to this. Recording police violence. So I believe that we are not the experts on this, but there's a lot of really good resources on the value of turning the eyes on the police, so that, you know, that is a way to counter the watching part of surveillance. But yeah, there is the double edged sword aspect of how police comb social media for faces, you know, and live streams. So the IRB part, Josh just answered, and yeah, we had extensive conversations with IRB, and they were like, no, it wasn't human subjects. You know, they just made the bazooka and handed it to the police, but, you know, the police just did what they do with the bazooka is kind of the explanation, simplistically.
And as a quick more bit about the clarification in the IRB, it seems like a lot of machine learning projects don't necessarily qualify for an IRB because they feel that we're making decisions based on the data without considering the people that underlie that data. So as long as things are framed as, oh, we're just working with data, then it's open season.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But one context for people who are not in academia is that IRB is a review board that all proposed research subjects or projects have to undergo if they might cause large harms to people or groups. So I think the question is asking, why didn't the IRB reject this project? And Josh had answered it.
Compromises coming from police union, tech companies, or lack of education. So we believe that the compromises were coming from both the understanding of the council as conservative in their actions, but also it definitely drastically changed after the bill went to public safety. So keeping hold on that bill after the police get their hands on it, an important part of the process and very difficult. Were there other questions that weren't here? I know we're 2 minutes before the end.
I think there was an interesting question towards the end of the doc about what are your thoughts on citizens recording / posting videos and photos of rallies with police violence? Is there a good way to get that evidence out there without betraying the faces of protesters? I think that's a really complicated question. I don't know if anyone has any.
Yeah, that was what I was trying to answer earlier about it's double sword. And recording police actions is more effective than body cams. But you know, these recordings can be used multiple ways, I think, right?
Okay, sorry, I missed that.
Yeah, and the other thing that, I mean, as we did the uncovering, like, it's really alarming that they passed the Ring Doorbell partnership right before this bill passed. It seems very not coincidental, at least to me, you know, in the fact that that partnership happened before the regulation. So there's a lot of follow-up that we definitely have to do.
And also it highlights the need for these kinds of bills because, like Emily mentioned, I believe it was Emily, that hyper surveillance really hurts the potential for activism, for protesting. And my personal thought is that shouldn't even need to be a question. Like if it happens where someone shows up into a video of police violence, the police shouldn't be able to take advantage of that, really. We know they do, but that's, to me, is just why it highlights the need for good legislation on this.
I'm also going to drop my email in the chat because I know we have this email sign up form, but if you want to contact more directly or immediately for anything, that's one way to do it. So yeah, we're at 3 o'clock. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Emily.
Yeah, I'm going to do the same. Anyone can feel free to contact me about further questions or really anything related to this. But yeah, thanks everyone so much for coming. This was really wonderful.
For accessing slides, you can email us and we'll send it to you. We also have our old teaching slides on our website at CAPP-PGH.org. So if you go there, I think we will eventually post these slides as well.
All right, shall we wrap up then?
Yep.
So thank you also to our amazing volunteers who teched the session. They are Bonnie Evans and Mark Neiman-Ross.
Yay!
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And yes, don't forget to fill out the form that they dropped in. All right, well, thank you. And I guess, will the moderators be closing up this room or?
Yeah, I'm happy to stick around, but if it has to end, it can totally end.
So yeah, the moderators will be closing this room here in just a little bit.
Okay.
But if you, it looks like the chat is kind of closing down and we've got participants leaving. So maybe give it another 5 minutes and then we'll turn off the recording and close the room.
Sounds good.
If you as the panelists want to debrief at all, this definitely is an opportunity to do so as well. So yeah, as long as you'd like.
Thank you all for joining again.
Yeah, these are really good questions. Like very sharp.
We hope we didn't depress everyone too much. Put a strong call to action to combat that.
Yes.
So can participants give feedback directly on that forum about the session they just attended?
There's a form that PRJS is sending around. I think it's in the chat, or I hope it's in the chat pod. It is in the chat pod. There it is, right there. Bonnie, we can see the form.
Yeah, you're sharing it. Thank you.
Yeah.
So will we have access to their feedback on our workshop if we get it?
That is an excellent question. I would suspect the answer is yes, but in the spirit of not making things up, I will get back to you.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you for joining. Oh yeah, we led our earlier teach-in sessions with screenshots and Minority Report for sure. Actually, I think for debrief, just so that y'all don't have to, sit in, we'll just open our own Zoom room and do it there. I think that might be best.
I think that's just as well. Yeah.
That sounds great.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you all again.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
everyone.
That was a
Nice
great
meeting you.